Welcome everyone to our webinar today on the Introduction to Academic Progress Monitoring. My name is Kyle Allen and I am a Technical Assistance Consultant with the National Center on Intensive Intervention. We are so thrilled that you joined us today and we are going to get started momentarily. We just want to give about a minute or so for people to join and then I'll bring us all back together. Okay, and I still see a few people joining, so we'll wait about, I don't know, 15, 20 more seconds, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Okay, we'll get started. So welcome again, everyone, to our webinar today titled Introduction to Academic Progress Monitoring. Again, my name is Kyle Allen, and I am a Technical Assistance Consultant with the National Center on Intensive Intervention. And I am joined by my colleague today, Kat Merkel. And Kat is primarily going to live in the background today. She is going to monitor the Q&A feature of our Zoom meeting today, as well as the chat. And so it's a good time to tell you if you have any questions, any thoughts, any comments, please feel free to put those in the chat. I see some things in there now. That's likely Kat. Go ahead and putting stuff in there. Kat is also going to drop some links in the chat, and that might be what's going in there now. So there's links to the slide deck for today, so you'll see those. And then also throughout the webinar today, Kat will drop relevant links that, again, are sort of on the topic of the conversation of the slide. So thank you, Kat, for being here. Always appreciate you. Yeah, so we'll get started. Let's see here. Okay, so our objectives today are pretty broad. Again, this is really just an intro to progress monitoring, really hoping by the end of this we can do a few of these things. So firstly, just really defining progress monitoring, understanding what it is and what its purpose is. We're always going to look at the role of progress monitoring through the lens of DBI. And so if you are not aware of DBI, also known as data-based individualization, I would highly encourage you to go to the NCII website, which is just intensiveintervention.org, and check out some of our resources. That's really our mission, is to talk about DBI, which is just a process to help students with intensive needs. Obviously, if you want to learn more about DBI, you can go check out many of our resources. Part of the DBI process includes progress monitoring. That's probably my favorite step of the DBI process, and that's really what we're going to unpack today. And in doing that, we're going to describe the features of that progress monitoring process. So you'll see some of that, of course, as we work through this content. So firstly, let's just define what is progress monitoring. And so progress monitoring is just the repeated measurement of student performance over the course of an intervention to index and or quantify the responsiveness to that instruction or intervention, right? And there's some more words there, you can read those. But essentially, what I always say about progress monitoring is it really is what helps us determine the effectiveness of what we're doing through that intervention process, right? It's just the data that I believe drives our instructional process, right? And so when we provide, whether it's a tier 2 or a tier 3 intervention, perhaps it's part of the SDI that a student on an IEP receives. for us to really understand whether or not that instruction that that student or group of students is receiving, we need to be able to index or quantify the responsiveness to the instruction that they're receiving, right? So the whole idea of progress monitoring is to help us determine the effectiveness of the instruction that we're providing, okay? And again, we're going to unpack it much greater than that, right? Before we do that, though, I want to talk about these three different types of assessments, okay? And we have kind of a application or analogy, I guess, on the next slide. So these three types that we often talk about at the center are summative. That happens after instruction, and the purpose of that is just to really assess the learning that has or has not occurred, right? There's also diagnostic assessment. That's actually a part of the DBI process that we'll look at briefly. The whole idea there is that's going to happen before an instructional step. And the whole reason it happens before is because we want to use that diagnostic information to help us identify the skills that can help strengthen an intervention, right? Helps us understand the student's strengths and weaknesses, right? The things that they possess and the things that perhaps they struggle with. Okay. And then the last type that you see on the slide here is just formative assessment. That happens after instruction, right? And so we're using that to determine whether or not they've learned post instruction, right? Some of that gets confusing, and so we've created this silly analogy, or story, if you will, right? And so when we kind of compare this idea of formative and summative assessment, right? It's like the cook in the kitchen, right? And so the formative here is as the cook is actually making the soup, right? It always weirds me out to think that a cook is tasting the soup in the kitchen. Hopefully not putting the spoon back in like this picture looks like. But either way, the whole idea is that, you know, we're sort of sampling it as we go to determine if it's what we want, if it's what we desired, right? Whereas summative is after the fact, right? So once the soup actually makes it to those who are visiting the restaurant, our customers, right? That's more of a summative assessment, right? And so they're going to determine if we hit the mark or not. So formative being kind of throughout, summative being after, if that makes sense. And we didn't want to leave diagnostic out, although there's not a great diagnostic soup example. So the diagnostic assessment piece here is, as we said, it's really designed to just determine the student's strengths and skills gaps that exist. Also helps us to identify factors within the instruction curriculum environment that can impact their learning. Okay. I like to think about diagnostic as kind of diving deeper. Kat, did you have a thought?
Yeah, someone in the chat wants to know where would screening fit in within these types of assessments?
I'm so glad that they asked because we're actually going to talk about that on the next slide. So thank you, whoever asked, and thank you, Kat, for jumping in. Obviously, continue to do that. So yeah, when we think about progress monitoring and screening, so again, thank you for the person who asked. Screening is what happens with all students, right? 3 times per year is generally the suggestion around that. Happens at grade level and really is designed to help us determine sort of overall risk status, much like when you go to the doctor for an annual checkup, right? The whole idea is that screening as well as progress monitoring, so you can see kind of the components of the progress monitoring on the right side of the slide, but both of these are considered formative assessments. And the reason that is they happen throughout the school year, right? So we're kind of measuring learning as it's happening, right? So if we screen at the beginning of the year and then we screen again in the middle of the year, we kind of have an idea of what has been learned and what still needs to be learned, right? And that's why it's formative. Now, shifting to progress monitoring, because that's why many of you guys are here today, that is really about grade level or skill level, right? So oftentimes we can progress monitor on the grade level that the student's enrolled in, but oftentimes, and we'll talk about this on a slide later, we might have to drop back, right? And really measure certain skills that perhaps a student didn't obtain earlier on in their academic career. Progress monitoring helps us determine rates of growth. I like to call those rates of improvement. It happens for students at risk, where screening obviously is all students. Progress monitoring is really just for those students who've been identified as at risk. And then when we talk about frequency of progress monitoring, it really depends on the intensity of the intervention, right? And so it could happen monthly, bi-weekly, weekly, sometimes even daily, which I know sounds crazy, but that would be like for a behavior example, right? So again, wonderful question, really good timing as well. The other thing that we often talk about when we talk about this idea of progress monitoring is just the difference between progress monitoring and monitoring progress. And every time I talk about this, I feel like it's a little bit confusing because they're the same words, just mixed, right? But monitoring progress is something that good teachers do every single day. Pat's heard me say this because we've provided professional development in a lot of places together, but I think even when we're teaching adults, right, like professional development, we do this monitoring progress when we go and work with educators, right? It's really just making sure that as I'm instructing something every day, so a teacher who's teaching something new, we provide this immediate questions, opportunities for students to respond that give us real-time data that can drive our instruction immediately in the moment, right? It's often informal and unstandardized and can be utilized for all students, right? So that's monitoring progress. What we're talking about is the more formalized progress monitoring, right? That has that standardized delivery, really requires those valid and reliable measures. We've talked about the frequency. It does require that ongoing data, requires graph data, and really it's, again, utilized for students receiving either targeted or intensive intervention. I want to be clear, both of these, in my opinion, are very critical to the educational experience. So we're not saying one is more important than the other. We just want to make the distinction between the two. Okay. All right, so obviously kind of defined what is progress monitoring, but also want to talk about why it's important, right? And so these are just a couple examples here. If you have some examples, feel free to put that in the chat. We'd love to hear from other people and why they think progress monitoring is important. But really, when you break it down, it's to us these things, right? And so progress monitoring data allows us to do a couple things that really, I think, speak to the importance of it. So it helps us estimate those rates of improvement across time. Well, when we're trying to catch a student up, that's critical, right? It helps us save time. If I can look at a progress monitoring graph and say, well, based on their data, this is where they're headed, right? And it helps me estimate where they might be at the end of the year so I can make a decision before the end of the year as to whether or not they're going to make their goal or not. So then I don't have to waste all that other time. It helps us compare the efficacy of different forms of instruction. Again, if I am delivering an intervention and I'm progress monitoring to determine the effectiveness of that instruction, then I can make that determination, right, about the efficacy of those different forms of instruction. Again, it helps us identify students who are not demonstrating adequate progress and likely need additional support. It helps us determine when an instructional change is needed. I'll show you that when we look at these graphs and tell you how progress monitoring is designed to help us understand when an instructional change is needed. I think underutilized, it should help us support communication with our parents and our students. Students love to track their growth. They love to understand why they're making growth, perhaps why they're not making growth. We have a slide that kind of talks about that. Again, I think it's underutilized. I think oftentimes we assess students and then don't ever talk about it with them. And I don't think that's best practice, right? So we could talk about reasons of how to do that, or I should say ways of how to do that, but I think that's really important for students. There's a lot of research around that. It also supports the development of a rigorous individualized education program for students with disabilities, right? I talked about SDI, specially designed instruction. We have a lot of resources at the center, NCII, about utilizing this data-based individualization process to design and deliver specially designed instruction. So if you live in that world of special education, supporting students on IEPs, please go look at our resources. We have tons of free resources that I think could be helpful for you. The other thing, kind of quickly before we jump into some more thoughts here are just the benefits of progress monitoring. I won't read this to you, but I just want you to know there's tons of research out there on the benefits of progress monitoring, right? Especially for students who are low performing, whether it's students with disabilities, English learners, low socioeconomic status, right? Like there's just tons of research around the effectiveness of progress monitoring as we provide instruction to students. Okay. All right, a couple other things here, and then we're going to really shift gears to talking more kind of structure for the rest of our time together, right? So I talked about the benefit of communicating progress monitoring, whether students are making adequate growth or the lack of adequate growth. So again, either responsive or non-responsive, and whether it's to the child themselves, the student, or the parent. I think there's a lot of research that says that that's a powerful thing to do, right? And so I'll just read this. I hate reading slides to people, but I think for us to all be on the same page, and I can't see anybody, that might be beneficial. So this is a quote from a parent in Wyoming. Both of these quotes are from the state of Wyoming. We did extensive work with the State Department of Education in Wyoming around this DBI process, obviously talking about progress monitoring here, right? So this was a parent. She said, looking at her graphs with her child, I feel like we're on the same page because it shows me what her progress is. It lets me know that she's not just staying at the same level, she's learning something, getting better, and starting to comprehend what she's doing day to day. Okay, so that's just a quote from a parent around kind of the effectiveness of or the benefit of progress monitoring, right? And this is actually a quote from a teacher, and it just says, I think it's really improved my relationships with my students, being able to talk to them about where they can improve and then have those same conversations with parents and other teachers. So again, even though this quote is from a teacher, it's really about the teacher-student experience and the teacher sharing that information, communicating the progress or lack thereof with the student, right? And using that to not only build relationships, but to give feedback, right? That's where a lot of this research lives, is on feedback to students and allowing them to see, whether or not they're making progress and whether or not all that work that we're asking them to do in those interventions matters, right? And I think there's just a lot of importance to that. So okay, so this is the kind of big picture of DBI. Again, hopefully many of you all are familiar, at least somewhat, with this process of DBI, and that perhaps is why you're here today. If you're not familiar with DBI at all, that's also totally okay. But I always would encourage you to go read more about it. I have to tell you quickly, I was a school psychologist for years before I joined working at the center. And when I started at the center, I'd actually not heard much about DBI, but I actually found that I knew a lot about this process. And many of you guys will likely admit the same thing, that perhaps you don't know that it's called DBI, but you're very familiar with these steps. Okay. And so I'll challenge myself to not get into all the steps of the DBI process and really just focus on the progress monitoring aspect, right? I think the only thing I'll really say about progress monitoring as it relates to the other steps is you'll notice that progress monitoring always comes right after an instructional step, right? So if you see this, like if you're looking at the visual on the right side, right, there's orange rectangles and there's green ovals. And those orange rectangles are just instructional steps of the DBI process. Okay. You'll notice every time you have orange rectangle, right after that is progress monitoring, right? And it makes sense if you think about it, because when we defined what is progress monitoring, well, progress monitoring is what helps us determine the effectiveness of instruction. So it makes sense that it comes right after an instructional piece within this process known as data-based individualization, okay? So I probably said all of this, but just to make sure we're all on the same page with the content on the slide, progress monitoring is important for a couple things. It's really important for understanding that student responsiveness, like we just talked about, but also helping us determine when, and that's the big thing you'll always hear me say about progress monitoring. Progress monitoring tells us when an instructional change is needed, okay? And I'm going to do like a little teaser here. If you want to know more about how to make an instructional change, that happens in the diagnostic data step. Okay, so again, if you want to know about how to change your instruction in this DBI process, go to our website. You can actually click, we have a visual just like this, and you can click on the diagnostic data step and learn so much more about the diagnostic data step. That's not why we're here today, but I'd love for you to learn more about that. We actually have some opportunities coming up where we're going to talk specifically about diagnostic data. So if you want to learn more about how to make the instructional change, check that out. Right now, we're talking about progress monitoring, which again helps us determine when a change is needed. And again, when we look at a graph, I'll show you exactly what I mean by that. But really, when we talk about progress monitoring, we're really talking about a couple things, right? It's collecting the data, it's graphing the data, and then it's analyzing the progress, right? And that helps us understand whether or not a student is responsive to the instruction or non-responsive, okay? So what do we mean by student responsiveness? Okay, I'm just going to read this to you. But a student is responsive to the intervention if progress monitoring data indicate that they are on track to meet their goal for the intervention, right? So we talked about how progress monitoring can help us estimate rates of improvement. That's exactly what we're doing here as we look at a student's responsiveness or non-responsiveness, right? Oftentimes we'll talk about trend lines, and that can even help us, estimate beyond, sort of into the future, right? Um, so overall, again, what we mean by responsiveness is, as we know, progress monitoring helps us determine the effectiveness of that instruction. So the student's either responsive, meaning the instruction was effective, or they're non-responsive, which would tell us that the instruction was not effective, right? And then according to whether they are or are not responsive, that really determines our next step in that DBI process. And again, if you want to learn more about that, you can email me and I will talk to you for days and days about the DBI process because I just love it that much. I think we'll share my email. Kat, you can put my email in the chat, or I think we shared at the end. Either way. Um, so this is how we're going to structure the rest of our time together. Okay. And again, the whole idea for this is to be kind of broad, right? It's really about getting started with progress monitoring. I will tell you right now, if you're interested in learning more, at the end of today, I'm going to share just another opportunity to go a little bit deeper, actually specifically around all of these pieces. We've got some follow-up workshops beyond this intro webinar that we would love for you all to participate, where we're going to go deeper. Okay, it'll also be more hands-on. There'll be more interactiveness to it, where this webinar is just kind of me talking. The workshop's going to go deeper into each four of these topics, or all of these topics, I should say. All right. But this is how we're going to structure the rest of the day. So the first thing that we're going to talk about here is just identifying the target behavior and also selecting an appropriate tool and what goes along with that, right? So things to consider when we think about we need to progress monitor this specific target behavior, what type of tool should we select? Okay, so we'll walk through this and kind of break that down. All right. Kat, feel free to jump in if there's any pertinent questions that come up. All right, so go. No, okay. Thought you had something. What is a target behavior, right? The target behavior is really just the outcome of interest for the student. Okay, so we've got a couple examples here. When we think about target behaviors within this world of academics, these are just some of the examples that many of us are likely very familiar with. Okay, things like passage reading fluency, right? That's something that we can measure. That's a behavior that we're targeting that we want students to get better at, right? So perhaps we have data, whether it's screening data, whether it's data from an IEP that says this is a skill that they struggle with. And so we want to target that behavior. And if we're going to target it, we certainly want to measure it, right? To determine if we're making a difference, if those interventions that we're providing are working or not working, right? So passage reading fluency would be one of those. Word identification fluency is another one. You hear fluency a lot when we talk about these different tools. We'll talk about those in more detail in a couple slides here later on. But that just helps us measure the automaticity, right? How automatic is a student with the skill, right? So passage reading fluency, is it a skill that's automatic for them, or do they have to think a lot about it? Do they have to really break it down and use a lot of their cognition to be able to do it? Okay, so we'll talk about fluency a little bit. There's also skills that we target that perhaps we don't measure with fluency measures, right? So something like quantity discrimination, things like total words written. Okay, so these again are just examples. There's certainly more of them. This is not an exhaustive list, obviously, but we're going to talk a little bit more about skills that we can measure. But before we do that, we want to talk briefly about what to look for when we think about progress monitoring measures. Okay. And so I'll briefly talk about these and kind of give a little bit of information about why these things are important. Probably things that you all likely know. Okay. So when we're thinking about a progress monitoring measure, we want to make sure that we're looking for these things, right? So for example, brief and easy to administer. Okay. What do we mean by brief? Well, it's something that shouldn't take a lot of time, right? If it's something that we're going to do weekly or bi-weekly and perhaps with a group of students, we want to make sure that it's not going to eat up a lot of our educational day, right? You hear teachers say all the time, or educators say, we spend way too much time assessing. And I often don't disagree with that sentiment. My thought is, are we using the assessment time to drive our instruction? And if we are, then in my opinion, it's useful, right? But we still want to make it brief. We want to not use up all of our time assessing, right? Easy to administer. Obviously, we wouldn't want to do something that's difficult. Okay, pretty self-explanatory. Able to be used repeatedly across time. Okay, we get asked this a lot. Why do you have to have so many different measures? Well, think about it. If we're trying to quantify or index a skill over time, we need to be able to repeatedly measure it, right? And so one thing that's not here, and it may come up later, is you also want it to be equal difficulty, right? You don't want to have something that you can use repeatedly, but the difficulty changes, because then it's like, well, one week they might do bad, and it's not because they're not growing in their skill. It might just be because that week it was harder, right? So we always want it to be equal difficulty when we repeat, okay? Sensitive to change. If you're doing something that's not sensitive to change, let me rephrase that. If you're measuring something that's not sensitive to change, you're wasting your time. I always use this silly example, but I have 3 children. When they go to the doctor, they always measure their height. When I go to the doctor, do they measure my height? The answer's no. And the reason is because my height is no longer sensitive to change. It's the same that it was last time. I've not done anything to grow in my tallness or not tallness, whatever. My children are, right? And so we would say that their height is sensitive to change. And so we measure that, right? Same thing with academic skills, like, for example, reading comprehension. Something that's not very sensitive to growth in a short amount of time makes it difficult to measure, right? We also want to make sure that the tools that we utilize, the measures, are valid, meaning that they're measuring what we wanted to measure. They're reliable, meaning that they measure the same thing every time, and that they're evidence-based and that they have research that supports them. All right. So hopefully either that was kind of reinforcing what you knew or perhaps maybe some new information. Just a couple other things around considerations for selecting a progress monitoring measure, specifically for this process of data-based individualization. Avoid using a progress monitoring measure that does these things, right? That cannot be administered weekly, right? DBI is typically for students with intensive needs. When you're providing that level of support, you want to know, is there a payoff as quickly as you can, right? And that should go for any system. If you're putting a lot of effort into something, you want to know as quickly as you can if the effort you're putting into that is paying off, right? And if you can't administer a progress monitor every week, you might waste time of resources that either aren't necessary or perhaps not working. And we can't afford to do that, especially when students are behind, okay? We don't want to use measures that take a long time. I've already mentioned that. Don't want to use something that doesn't have evidence. I know that's a double negative, but you know what I'm saying. Also, stay away from things that have that do not have equal interval data. Okay, so we'll keep going here. All right. Another kind of introduction kind of bucket or thought around progress monitoring is this idea of establishing a progress monitoring plan, right? And these topics are in sequential order, right? So once we've identified that target behavior, right, the skill that we want to measure, and we've chosen the appropriate tool, we now want to move and establish that progress monitoring plan, right? So what is this going to look like? Okay. And I tell people all the time, I used to say this all the time as an educator in a district that I worked in. If you do not create the time and the space to make sure that these things happen, they just won't, right? I mean, because they take work and they take effort. And so we have a lot of resources around how to establish a progress monitoring plan. Again, one of our future workshops, we're going to talk in much detail around this, point you to some of those resources. Overall, though, I just want to tell people that these are things that you have to be thoughtful about, right? They don't just happen on their own, okay? So when we think about establishing a progress monitoring plan, we want to encourage you to think about these things, okay? Who will collect the progress monitoring data? Oftentimes that's the general education teacher, special education teacher, perhaps it's a reading specialist, some sort of instructional specialist, right? It can be different in different buildings, right? However, it is, we just want to make sure that we have a plan and we understand who that person will be, okay? We want to think about how often the data will be collected. We've talked about the importance of that already. And so just naming that and identifying it is important, right? As we think about what's this going to look like. Obviously, want to think about what tool is going to be utilized to collect the data. Again, we just talked about that as well as the timeline and the frequency of data collection. And then lastly, and we're going to talk a little bit about this on the next slide, we also want to include that baseline data and that goal. And the reason that's so important as we think about planning this is that's really the baseline data and the goal. That's really the first step to this progress monitoring graph, right? That's kind of what allows us to create the graph that as we continue to plan out what this is going to look like, we can continually come back to. Okay, so a little bit more about goal setting as it relates to creating this plan. Um, at the center, NCII, there's really three approaches that we recommend for setting goals. And we have a resource around this. I'm sure Kat's either going to put it in the chat or maybe already has. Um, but they really differ in when you would utilize them. Again, not saying one's better than the other, but I would say that there's advantages and considerations for all three of them. Okay. So one of them is benchmarking. I would say this is oftentimes the most commonly utilized goal, especially for students that are going through like a MTSS tiered process. Benchmarking would just be what are those cut scores, those norms that those assessment tools put out there, right? We use that score as the goal, okay? Moving on to that, and what I like to talk about when we talk about these goal setting strategies is these move towards being more individualized as we talk about them, okay? So benchmarking would be the least individualized, and if you think about it, you're just saying, hey, we're just going to give you the goal that we expect or the publisher of the assessment expects all kids to get to, right? There's nothing individualized about that. Moving down to national norms for weekly rate of improvement, that becomes a little more individualized, again, without getting into the weeds of the formula of how you do national norms for rate of improvement. It actually includes the student's baseline score. So obviously my national norms for weekly rate of improvement goal would look different for each one of my students, assuming they all had a different baseline score. Okay. Now it's still standard in a way because it is still using norms on the rates of improvement. Okay. Our last goal setting strategy, which is the most individualized and frankly, I think is the least utilized goal setting strategy, is the intra-individual framework. This goal, in my opinion, is really utilized for students who are already receiving specialized instruction, right? Who perhaps are already on an IEP. It cannot be utilized to determine eligibility for special education because you're not comparing that student to a sample of students, right? You're only comparing them to themselves, which is where they get the term intra-individual framework, okay? Either way, overall, I want you to know there's really no right or wrong goal setting strategy. As I mentioned, there's advantages and considerations for all of them. Again, if you want to learn more about them, please check out our website. I know Kat put the link in there. You can go check it out. And if you have questions, reach out to us. We'd love to talk more about them. Okay, so moving from, again, identifying that target behavior, like what is the thing that we need to address with our intervention? What is the actual progress monitoring assessment or measure that we can utilize? We want to move into that plan, right? Like who's going to collect the data, when we're going to collect the data. And once we have that plan and we have a goal set, we have a graph, right, that we can actually start looking at, are they making growth or not? Then we would move to this idea of collecting and graphing the data. Okay. And so that's this next bucket that we're going to dive into.
Kyle,
Okay.
I'm just gonna jump in real
Yeah.
quick.
Thank you. Go
There's some
ahead.
questions that I'm gonna save to the end, but one that I think is relevant now is the assessment that one person's district recently adopted has norm ranges that they have made publicly available, but has not shared weekly ROI norms for more in-depth national norms. Do you have suggestions for resources they could use to locally norm out students to help with establishing reasonable goals? That was
Yeah.
long, so if you want me to repeat, let me know.
I'll do my best. And I think there's some reasons to do that, but I would also caution you in doing that, and I'll explain a little bit. And Kat, if I'm getting off track, bring me back, okay? Um,
Mm-hmm.
so for one, I think, and this should make sense, and we won't get into the weeds of it, so maybe we could connect later. But if you have like these benchmark windows, if you have the norms for that, then you essentially have the norms for rates of improvement, right? Because for example, if you know there's, let's say, whatever, 18 weeks, right, between fall and winter screening, and you have the scores, you can divide that score by the number of weeks, which would give you a weekly rate of improvement. So for example, if a norm for, you know, below benchmark is 20 in the fall, and then below benchmark is 40 in the winter. Well, that's a difference of 20. Divide that by 18 weeks. I'm not good at math, but it would be something like 1.15 or something like that. And so I'm just saying you can almost actually create or figure out, I should say, what the weekly rates of improvement would be based on the norms for the windows. And I've done that in the past. Uh, your question about local norms, I just would caution anybody in doing that because when you do that, you're not going to inevitably, I should say, eventually, inevitably be able to look at that responsiveness or lack thereof and determine whether or not a student is performing like a student who would benefit from receiving specialized instruction. And so I think there's cases where it makes sense to create local norms. I just want people to understand that when you do that, I think it can challenge or make it harder to look at eligibility. And you all know that's not the purpose of this, but it is, you know, a thing that we can utilize this data to do. So we can talk more about that. I'd love you can email me and we can, you know, get into specific questions. But I love your thoughts, and I love when people ask questions like that because I like to go deeper than, you know, what we are afforded the time to do on these kind of broad webinars. So, Kat, I don't know if there's another question. We can probably get into one more. So,
One person was wondering about CBM.
mhm.
So let me just scroll back up. How important are CBM to progress monitoring? If we use CBM for academic progress monitoring, why do special education teachers not use CBM for progress on IEP goals?
Hmm. Yeah, so CBMs, for those who aren't aware, are curriculum-based measures, and I would say are critically important to this idea of progress monitoring. For those of you who don't know, curriculum-based measures are often like fluency measures, not always, so don't anybody like cuss at me. I'm not saying they always are, but oftentimes they are. And curriculum-based measures are really great progress monitoring assessments because of the things that we've talked about when we select tools, right? We want things that are brief, easy to administer. And that's, I think, my opinion of why CBMs are great for progress monitoring. The last part of that question is not confusing to me, but maybe surprising as to why a special education teacher wouldn't utilize a CBM to monitor IEP goals. I would think, and again, email me, we can get into it. I would think that they should, would be my initial response. So I would be curious as to why they're not. And maybe they have a good reason as to why they're not. So, okay. We'll keep going and hopefully, Kat, you know me, I'm long-winded, but hopefully we can get into more of these questions at the end because these are really good
Sounds good.
questions. I'm going to share, like, these are some of the best questions I think we've elicited in, uh, our past intro webinars. So I appreciate everybody asking those questions. Hopefully we can get into more of them at the end. So into this idea of collecting and graphing this data, right? Always talk about why graphing the data is so important, okay? And obviously you can see the bullets here, but essentially the reason it's important to graph the data is so we can make sense of it, is really the whole reason, right? Kat and I have actually worked with districts where we go out and they have questions about their progress monitoring data and we look at it and we say, well, let's try to make sense of it. And they're like, okay, well, let's look at it. And it's literally just numbers on a page or perhaps like an Excel spreadsheet, and it's not graphed. And the reality is that's hard, right? It's hard to make sense of progress or responsiveness or lack thereof, non-responsiveness when it's just numbers on a spreadsheet, right? And so again, many of you guys know this. Many of these publishers create tools that allow us to graph it. Again, so we can do these things, right? Like visual analysis, quick and easy decision making, simple communication, right? Like all the things that many of you guys likely know of, okay? So these are the things that we would expect to see as part of the graph. Again, we're going to spend more time on this, specifically looking at parts of the graph in one of these future workshops. But we'll just kind of briefly discuss, right? Like there's a baseline. We talked about that when we talk about the plan, including that. We also talked about the importance of the goal, right? And you'll notice there's this green line that connects the baseline point and the goal score. And we often call that the goal line at NCII. In my past, like to call it the aim line. Again, the reason that is it's kind of the aim or the trajectory or the rate of improvement that has to be made or is required to get from where you started to where we want you to be, what the goal is, right? So I call that I call that required rate of improvement, right? You see, we have like actual progress monitoring data points. Those are just those blue dots as we do this weekly or bi-weekly measuring the effectiveness of our instruction. We plot it on the graph, right? And some of those tools that we utilize will then give us a trend line. Anytime you see a line on a graph, that's just a rate of improvement, right? So the other thing I like to call the trend line is the actual rate of improvement. And the reason I call it actual rate of improvement is because that's what they're actually doing versus the goal line, which is what I like to call the required rate of improvement, right? So then you can compare actual rate of improvement trend line to required rate of improvement goal line. And that's what helps you make a determination that's quantifiable, right, with numbers about the effectiveness of the instruction that you're providing and whether or not a student is responsive or non-responsive. Okay, that's how we use a graph in that way. We always talk about, when we talk about this idea of collecting and graphing, this idea of data collection quality considerations, right? And you all know, right? I talk about this all the time. Uh, you know, uh, NCII and a lot of our other centers live in this research world. I look at a lot of things through the practice lens because that's what I spent a lot of my career doing. Research, I say, happens in a vacuum. School happens in chaos, and those are opposite things. And so when we collect data, we want to consider the things that impact the quality of that data collection. Okay. Again, we have a whole resource around this. I'm sure Kat has likely shared it in the chat. But there's things like inconsistent assessment administration. So, like changes to the environment. I used to work in a school and we would see this highly variable data. And I asked the teacher, I said, why do you think this happens? And she says, well, I have noticed when I take him in this other room where there's no kids, he does a lot better. But we only do that when it's available. Okay, well, don't do that because now we're changing the the whole assessment process, right? And so no wonder we're seeing changes in the data. And really what we want to measure is again the effectiveness of the instruction. Well, when you change environment, you're measuring the environment and their ability to function in the environment, not is the instruction we're providing working or not. Okay. Incorrect or variable instruction. So again, giving students the wrong instructions, giving them too much time to go through the progress monitoring probe, right? And answer more questions than perhaps they would have. Inappropriate assistance, again, educators have a hard time with that. I get it. I was a classroom teacher at one time in my life, and we're there to help, right? But when we measure and assess, there are certain things that we can and cannot do, right? We often will also at times at NCII talk about errors that happen when we score assessments as well as errors when we enter the data. Again, go to our website. This is a resource that you can print. I think it's just a one page, maybe front and back, and it talks more about these different data collection quality considerations. Okay. And then quickly, the last piece of this, because I want to save some time for questions, hopefully, especially since it seems like you all have some, is the point of all of this, right? The reason that we do all of these three steps prior to this one is so we can do this one, right? And that's to evaluate the student responsiveness. And I'll just tell you, it drives me crazy as a school psychologist to see so many educators work so hard to do the first three things, and then they don't do anything with the last step, right? So we collect all this information and then we just let it sit, right? Whether it's on a shelf or in a software or in a spreadsheet, wherever it may be. And I'm like, well, you did all the work. Now let's make it work for us, right? So if you're going to work for data, make data work for you. Okay. And that is really when we talk about evaluating the responsiveness of the student, which again is the definition of progress monitoring. Okay. So what we're really talking about here is interpreting the progress monitoring graphs, right? So use graph data to make those timely decisions about that student responsiveness, right? We defined responsiveness earlier. It's really just looking at the student and the growth or lack of growth that they're making and comparing that to that required, right? That required rate of improvement versus their actual rate of improvement. Is there a gap? Are they headed towards their goal or not? If a student is not responding adequately, then it is time to make a change to the intervention, right? I told you that progress monitoring tells us when to make a change. And if we have data that says that they're not on track, that's data that tells us when to make a change. Okay. At NCII, we have decision rules. Decision rules are a very important part of this progress monitoring process. It's like I tell my kids when we play a board game, there's rules and we're all going to play by them. So we all understand, right, that this is what's expected. It's no different than with decision rules for analyzing progress monitoring data. Okay. You can learn more about this. This is a resource. I know Kat probably just put it in the chat where you can look at these. And kudos to Kat. Kat made this resource. Okay. So we know it's awesome. But no, seriously, she did. And it's a really great resource to think about the decision rules specifically for analyzing that progress monitoring data. These are just examples of those, okay? Again, you can read more about them through the resource, but there's three of them. There's 4-point analysis method, which is just this one. Essentially, what we're saying here is based on the four most recent data points, what analysis or decision should be made, right? And so again, this is the required rate of improvement. This is the goal line. This is what they're required to do to be on track. If their four most recent data points are below the required rate of improvement, they're not making enough growth. We would want to intensify. Okay. Again, that would be moving us into the next step of the DBI process. If you want to learn more about that, you know what to do. Okay. Another example is trend line analysis. Okay. We haven't talked about these vertical lines. These are just called phase lines. They just represent different phases of this intervention process, and that's pertinent to this graph, and you'll see why. Okay. Here's my required rate of improvement, my goal line, what a student has to do to get from where they started, baseline, to where I want them to be, goal. Okay. Here's their actual data. Their actual data tells me about their actual rate of improvement compared to their required rate of improvement. This is bad. They're going the wrong way, right? Is what this tells me. So what we need to do is adapt, and this is part of the DBI process, that intervention. So this is a phase line signifying some sort of adaptation. So what happens in this second phase is different than what happened in this first phase. And that's important visually, right? Which is why we graph data so we can do visual analysis. So we can see when there's a change like this is a pretty significant change, that it's because we adapted the intervention. So now their actual rate of improvement is looking more like their required rate of improvement based on where they started and the goal that we set for them. It's still, when we look at it, not going to help them meet their goal. So we're doing a second adaptation to the intervention with the first adaptation. Now we're looking at the actual rate of improvement versus the required rate of improvement. And you can see that looks good, right? Like they're gonna meet their goal if they keep improving like they have been in the last couple weeks. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. That's trend line analysis. And then one that really is, I think, the newest decision rule. There's a lot of new research coming out about this, about the how easy this can be, is median of the last three. Okay. So again, we have our required rate of improvement. Again, how do we get from where we started to where we want them to be? That's the required rate of improvement. And then we just look at the median of the last three data points. Okay. So all this stuff doesn't matter, right? It's just the last three. Okay. They mattered at some point, right? But now we have three new ones. Okay. So median of the last three means the middle value of the last three data points. Here's your highest, here's your lowest, here's your median. Okay. Now, I could go either way on this, and I think as long as you have data to substantiate your claim, I would be fine with whatever decision you made. If you're a hard and fast rule follower, you could make the decision that this is below the aim line or the goal line, the required rate of improvement. And therefore, if you want to intensify, I'm all for it. If you want to tell me that there's reason to believe that if you collected one more data point, that perhaps they'd be above, I'm fine with that too, right? And that's where if we're utilizing data to drive our instruction, I'm good with it. Okay. I'm going to go through these pretty quickly because I want to save some time. Common challenges with academic progress monitoring, there's a few of them here. Assessments not aligned with the content of the intervention. We see that. Level of assessments too difficult. The goal for the student is inappropriate. Lack of clarity. The assessment's not administered in a consistent way. We briefly touched on that. Or data are not collected frequently enough to allow for timely decisions. Okay. What's next in the DBI process? Well, we briefly hit on this, but when a student's non-responsive, I talked about progress monitoring being what kind of drives us through this DBI process. When they're non-responsive, we're going to move to this diagnostic data step. And that's what tells us how to make a change. Progress monitoring tells us when, right? And we just follow this line here. Diagnostic data is going to tell us how to make a change. Okay, if you want to learn more about that, I'm going to tell you how in just a minute. Okay. So in summary, again, in the DBI process, progress monitoring is really, I think, one of the most crucial steps in determining whether an intervention is working or not. Okay, again, determines the effectiveness of the instruction they're receiving. Progress monitoring has those four main steps, right? We highlighted them. We'll talk about them in greater detail in the workshops, but it's identifying the target behavior, selecting that tool, establishing that plan. We then are going to collect and graph the data, and then we're going to use all of that to evaluate the student responsiveness. Okay. In these next sessions, as I mentioned, we're going to discuss each of these steps in detail. Okay, so what does that look like? We actually have a two-part academic progress monitoring workshop. I'm sure Kat will share the registration link in the chat. The first session is just on selecting and implementing those measures. That's going to be on October 9th. I believe that's another Thursday. It'll be 3:30 to 4:45, so it's actually 75 minutes if I'm any good at math. So it's a little bit longer. And the whole reason that is because there's activities embedded in there. Okay. And then the next session will be Thursday, October 30th. And that's just about developing that plan, which we talked about, and then using that data to drive our instruction. Okay. This is our event survey. Kat, I think you put that in there. I appreciate it. I forgot to add it. So if you guys would, we would really appreciate. I tell people all the time, we preach using data to drive instruction. This is our way to collect data from you all to drive our instruction. If you would be so kind to fill out this survey, it would be very meaningful, not to all of us, I mean, to all of us, but especially to me. I take it very personal. It helps me again, just shape my craft and how we instruct and determine the effectiveness of these webinars. So just like we preach through progress monitoring. And then I think that's it. Kat, I see you're off mute. What you got?
Yeah, that's it. But we have two questions and I think we can fit them in. But
Awesome.
if people have more, submit them anyway and we can try to get to them.
Sure.
So the first is about the frequency of progress monitoring, tier 2 versus tier 3, but also trying to balance having enough data to make a decision, but also not wasting time.
Yeah.
So someone's wondering if there's any big ideas or rationale to have these conversations with staff in determining their progress monitoring schedule.
Yeah, so this will be an answer, but you're going to want more probably. And I'm going to tell you, we are actually going to get specifically into the frequency of monitoring in a future session. I will tell you so I can give you an answer today. This is just kind of the center's go-to line around progress monitoring. Okay. So tier two, we would recommend every other week. Okay. And then when we move to tier three, which as you likely know is more intensive, we would say we want to progress monitor more frequently. And so we would recommend at the center weekly progress monitoring. Again, you're going to have teachers push back and say, well, gosh, that's too much assessment. And again, I don't completely disagree with that. I think it's important to make sure that your educators know that you hear them and you understand them. But the reality is that data is priceless if you use it to drive everything else that you do. So it's really more or less a question about do you actually utilize it? And I think if you do, then I think it's okay to collect it frequently enough to drive your instructional practices. There's also conversations that have to happen around feasibility, right? Because again, as I mentioned, we don't live in a vacuum. Like the research world, we live in chaos in schools. And I understand that sometimes things are chaotic. So hopefully that was a little bit of an answer to your question. And of course, I would encourage you to come to future sessions because I do believe we talk more about that in these workshops.
Thanks, Kyle. The next one is about whether you should use weekly rate of improvement or if your progress monitoring tool gives you like a cut score, should you just use that?
Yeah. It's a great question. I don't know that I have a specific answer. I don't think you could really go wrong either way. In fact, I think you could make cases based on like students and, their challenges and strengths as to perhaps why you would use one over the other. I think ultimately I would just say, again, if you use the national rates of improvement and you include the student's baseline score into that formula, that is going to be more individualized, right? So what I mean by that is if the cut score for, let's just say, third grade end of the year reading is 70, right? Well, the reason national rates of improvement become more individualized is because what you could do is you could say, well, this student actually their baseline is 10. So to get from like 10 to 70, that's really steep. Like they're probably not going to do that, right? But if I say, okay, well, what's the national rate of improvement, and maybe the national rate of improvement is 2 words per week. Well, I can use that, but if I use then that child's baseline of 10, the goal might only then have to be like 40 or 45, and they're still growing like kids we would want them to grow, but they're not going to get to that 70 because they just started too low, if that makes sense. So again, I think it just depends, unfortunately, is the answer there.